when the world falls silent and darkness takes over, strange things can happen. For those working the night shift, solitude can quickly turn to terror. From eerie encounters to unexplainable events, these are 3 true night shift horror stories from Reddit. Are you ready to face the darkness? This is probably the creepiest, most unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me. I used to work overnight as a security guard at the local port. Usually none of the port workers would stay overnight, except for the safety official. I wouldn't be on the shift alone since the site has a radius of nearly 2 miles. Overnight, usually there would be 3 guards, including me, since the area was fairly big. There were different posts, but front gate was the main entrance area where all the guards would be stationed overnight, since there was no need to put them in other posts due to the fact that there was no activity in the site at this time. The veteran guards that have been there for years would often say that the site was haunted, given the fact that there have been accidents and deaths that occurred in the area a long time ago. I was aware that people died there due to freak accidents, and I do believe in angels and demons since I'm actually a religious person, but I always thought that the superiors were just messing with the new guys. I would work 5 to 6 nights out of the week, and for the first few weeks, I never really saw or heard anything out of the ordinary, except for maybe a few questionable creaks and would see a few misplaced objects while doing my patrol rounds, but nothing too crazy. Just to describe the setting to you, this is a fairly big site, and on occasions when there were big projects being constructed at the port, the workers would sometimes stay overnight. Due to the fact that there were times where port workers were required to stay at the port for a few days, there's a gym in the site for their convenience. This gym is fairly old. In the gym, there's a sauna, weights, and even a racquetball court. If you don't know what a racquetball court is, it's similar to an indoor tennis court with thin plastered walls and thick glass doors. Usually on our patrol rounds, me and one of the other guards, Mike, would stop by the gym and play a few rounds of racquetball before returning back to the front gate. On one of those nights, me and Mike decided to hit a full workout instead of playing racquetball in the cage. This is around 2:30 a.m. and the entire building is so quiet that you can hear the electricity running through the lights. The air conditioner is off, and so is everything else. The only thing that's running are the lights. 15 to 20 minutes into the workout, we hear a loud thump. We crossed it off as nothing and continued working out. Then after a few more minutes, we heard the loud thump once more. At first we thought it was our lieutenant, which could have been walking around, but then we radioed him and he gave us his location, which was front gate. We tried thinking logically on what could be making those thumps on the wall. They were coming from the court on the other side. We thought it was the air conditioner, but then we remembered that it was off, and even when it switched on during the day, there's no reports of thumps coming from the air conditioner. After a few more minutes, the thumps started occurring one right after another. We were very creeped out at this point, but what we were about to witness still scares the absolute shit out of me till this day. We started to approach the other side of the gym to where the glass door was. We turned on the flashlight and aimed it towards the clear glass door, and I got chills all over my body and I started tearing so much out of fear that I was about to cry. We saw one of the balls rolling slowly by itself inside the court, but there was no one in there. So that means the loud thumps were the balls mysteriously being tossed against the wall, as if someone or something was playing inside the cage. We were both so confused and frightened to how this was really happening. We couldn't make any sense of it. We were scared shitless, and we started yelling and running away because we knew that there was probably something evil toying with us right there. As we sprinted full speed back to the front gate, the lieutenant saw us and asked why we were tearing up and running in a ridiculous manner. We told him what we witnessed, and his facial expression scared us even more. He then said, "That's why there's always guards that quit often. There's something evil in the area, and it's not the first time that something that bad has happened here." He then showed us security footage of dark figures and shadows literally passing through the office areas, and lights mysteriously switching on and off. Till this day, I still get chills recounting my experience with my friends and family, and I'm even getting chills right now as I'm typing this. I had never had a real encounter with the supernatural until that night. Many say that it was a demonic presence messing around. Others say it was a ghost of a dead person who died in the area. I don't know what it was, but I didn't last long in the job after that. There were other experiences, but I'll send that at a later time. What's up? A rather long story, but I'll try to keep it short. Still, I need to give some context so that you understand everything. I am from Germany, so my English isn't the best, but I try. I work as an operator and shift manager in an incineration plant for chemical waste. 2 years ago, I changed my company because at my previous company, there was an incident in which me and my crew nearly died, and the management pretty much said to me, "You nearly died, so let's try to avoid it in the future." And they didn't come up with a new safety concept. Assholes. Back to the story. I changed my workplace and I now operate in an incineration plant. Again, but this one is much smaller. Pretty cool here with a good work environment. The plant is part of an industry complex in a forest, and around the incineration plant is only woods except one of the production departments is our direct neighbor. A few months into the job, some of my co-workers told me that sometimes weird things happen in our department. What they meant is that sometimes you can hear footsteps near you or see a shadowy figure around a corner. Sounds interesting, right? Well, they had a pretty logical explanation for this. We not only use the incineration plant for chemical waste in forms of liquids like solvent, but we also burn away the toxic fumes that our other departments produce. So our direct neighbor has one production line in their basement, and the fumes this line produces are being transported via underground pipes through our basement into the plant to burn away. These fumes are not super dangerous, but at a high concentration they can cause hallucinations. But the pipes are pretty old, I think around 50 plus years actually, and they have seen better days. But because of the economic crisis in the last few years, the management decided to pause repairing projects, for example, old leaking pipes, like in our basements. So if you had the AC shut off for a long period of time inside the basement, these fumes would concentrate, and when you work there, you might get hallucinations. They said that most of the weird stuff was probably caused by this. So now, back to my experience. A month ago, I had night shift, and my coworker for the night shift was sick. So I was alone. 99.99% of the night shifts, nothing happens, and you just make the 2 inspection tours through the plant to get some data and see if there are any issues. So I didn't put much thought into being alone, even when it was my first time being alone in this company. I was even happy because I planned to watch a movie. So here I am at the night shift, and I make my first inspection tour. Nothing unusual until I need to get some data from the basement. I go downstairs and walk to the sensors for the data. Suddenly, I hear a creaking sound from behind me and footsteps walking down the metal stairs. I turn around, but I don't see a thing, of course. But I am a bit curious. Why? These stairs are sturdy as fuck. One of my coworkers is pretty obese, still super nice guy, and when he walked down these stairs, they didn't make the same loud noise I heard just now. So whatever it was that made this sound, needed to be at least over 370 pounds. I come to the conclusion that this must be a hallucination made by the fumes, so I decide to continue my tour and then turn on the AC for later. During this tour, I also see a shadowy figure at one corner, but I still thought, nah, just the fumes. As I return to the control room, I turn on the AC in the basement to get rid of any fumes. 4 hours later, I make my second and final inspection tour. Like before, everything normal. Then comes the basement. I still shake a bit while remembering this. I walk down again, AC turned on, remember, so there should be no fumes. And as I walk down, I can hear footsteps again directly behind me. I turn around, but there's nothing to see. I then continue to go to the sensors, and suddenly I hear footsteps again. But this time, not walking, but running. I turn around in a flash and I can see a shadow just in time as it goes around the corner. I am a bit shaken, but hurriedly collect the data and want to go back up and just leave the basement alone for the night. As I walk back upstairs, I hear these charging footsteps again, but this time from two directions, one from behind and one from upstairs. I've had enough and charge upstairs myself. As I reach the top of the stairs, I slightly turn around and only see a massive shadow halfway up the stairs. I run back to the control room and shut the door. Then I remember I had the AC turned on. That means there shouldn't be any fumes concentrated high enough to cause these kind of hallucinations. I shake, this time for real. I stand up and ponder if I should check the AC downstairs or wait it out. As I stand before the door, ready to leave the control room, I hear footsteps behind the door. Quiet footsteps, but definitely footsteps. I make my decision to not be a hero and just wait for the next shift. Later, the next shift comes and I tell them about my night shift. They laugh it off and tell me that probably the AC was being shitty again. I laugh with them and agree, even though I don't completely agree with the argument of a broken AC. I have the next 2 days off and I forget about it. Then, the next Monday, I arrive for my early shift, and I chat a bit with the guys from the night shift. My experience comes up again, and I begin to laugh like a few days ago, but my coworkers didn't. I ask them why. Well. As it turned out, the AC was completely fine, but what made my experience really scary was something else. Our neighboring department, which produces the fumes, wasn't running. Because of a lack of customers this year, they didn't have all the lines active for the year, and at my night shift, they had all the production lines turned off. That means they could never produce these fumes, which means whatever I saw there wasn't hallucinations caused by the fumes, but something else. Whatever I saw and heard in that basement was real. No hallucinations like many experienced all the time. No, I had just experienced something that scared everyone. My coworkers are now also cautious of the basement, and the manager of the incineration plant reported this to the higher-ups. They started an investigation 2 weeks ago, but until now didn't find a logical cause, how the noises and shadows were created, and neither found a solution. They now plan to repair these pipes as soon as possible, and in the next week, we will install cameras and sensors to find out what happens in the basement. I worked in the radiology department in a hospital in Cardiff, Wales, UK, for about 3 years as an admin and clerical officer before getting a promotion working in medicine. During these 3 years, I saw a lot of things, ranging from patients dying in the MRI scanners to patients having an X-ray for inserting a meat thermometer into their urethra. Nights always seemed the craziest. One time, a patient came in with armed police after an altercation which involved a knife in the middle of the city center, and just so happened the person he had the altercation with was having an x-ray too. This caused a second altercation right in front of me. Chairs were thrown, a trash bin or two, and then a wheelchair. So I have seen things. Some funny, some stressful, some sad, and many bonkers. But this one night, something scary. I would start a night shift at about 1900, then would work until about 0830 the next morning. This was the standard night shift for our department. We would usually do 3 nights in a row before doing 4 days off. After the third night, you were ready to sleep for a week. The strange thing was, this was my first night of the 3, so not at all tired. It started off normal. I arrived at the department, took over from the day staff, logged into my PC. During this time, we usually would set up our phones or tablets to watch movies or the latest TV series, as there would be a lot of downtime between patients. Like I said, the first few hours, nothing that interesting, just your average run-of-the-mill night in radiology. Then it came time for my break. Now, before I tell you more, I should probably explain the layout of this hospital. This hospital is the largest in Wales. It's a teaching hospital and it's pretty old. Now, the best way to get from A to B in the hospital is through what we call the tunnels, or the catacombs. These consist of very dimly lit corridors, old abandoned rooms, tunnels, and other creepy, decrepit areas. The morgue is also found in these corridors, so it's not a nice place to be during the day, let alone the middle of the night. But it's the quickest way to get places if you're staff. There's always been rumors and mumblings of strange things happening in these tunnels. Some people say they saw ghosts in old-fashioned porter uniforms taking wheelchairs to pick up patients. Others say they have seen shadows following them from the corner of their eyes. But one person has claimed they were attacked by a person wearing an old nurse's uniform from the 70s. This place is creepy even at the best of times. But for me, it never really fazed me. I've been down there hundreds of times before. The worst experience up to this point was having a sluice pipe drip human waste on my head. That in itself was a horror show. But tonight would be something altogether different. It may be not even of this physical world. Like I said before, it was a very quiet night. I had been watching the latest series of One Piece because I'm a geek. During my downtime, then a radiographer, or radiology technician for my American friends out there, came to take over and cover for me during my break. I decided to go to the 5th floor where the sanctuary, or a multi-faith chapel, was located. On a night shift, it was one of the most peaceful places in the hospital, but to get there, I had to walk through the tunnels to reach the nearest elevator. I set off on my journey, which would usually take about 15 minutes. Scanned my key card on the main entrance to the tunnels, then proceeded to walk through. 2 minutes in, I started to feel like someone was walking behind me. It being a busy hospital and basically the tunnels acted like the highway, I didn't think anything of it. Suddenly I hear panting, like someone was trying to catch their breath after going for an intense run. So I turned around to check and saw nothing. A bit strange, but thought it was nothing. Maybe just one of the pipes above my head was creaking or a generator pumping. So I carried on walking, but I kept feeling like someone or something was watching me and was walking behind me. Out of sheer confusion and fear, I missed my turn towards the elevators and found myself in a large section of the tunnels that I have never seen before. Littered with old stretchers, beds, hospital furniture, and equipment. Some of this stuff was over 50 years old, maybe older, just left to decay in a dark, smelly, decrepit, and dusty corridor. This was starting to really creep me out, because in all of this confusion, I realized I was lost. It almost felt like I had fallen into the back rooms. Everything looked the same. I could feel a tightening in my chest, and could feel the start of a panic attack. I remember clutching my chest and running down a corridor, trying to find a signpost or something to tell me where I was. The sense that something was watching me got stronger. Suddenly, I felt something hit my arm in force, almost like someone using a baseball bat. I remember falling to the ground, pulled myself across the floor towards the cold, dusty wall, and looked around frantically, trying to find an explanation to what the heck just hit me. Then something caught my eye. It was almost like a black mist with glowing red eyes. It was about 20 meters away from me, just hovering in the middle of the corridor. Was this the thing that had been stalking me the entire time? I got back up and sprinted. I ran down what it felt like 100 different corridors until I found a housekeeper, a janitor. He asked me what was wrong because I looked pale, but I couldn't get any words out. He then grabbed me by the arms with a firm grip and said, "Did you see it too?" That was the last time I ever stepped foot in the tunnels. To this day, I hear rumors of strange things. I'm not sure what I saw that night. Maybe I was tired, maybe I was stressed, maybe it was something. Why else would the janitor ask?